question is that the motion moved by the Prime Minister be agreed to, and I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Last night in Sydney, along with some of my colleagues, including the member for Barara, attended a gathering of people from the Jewish community. There were 12,000 people in total. The emotion was raw, and to mark the first anniversary, there were a number of fine speakers who contributed to the debate, including the New South Wales Premier Chris Minns. We heard from a number of people who had experienced firsthand the tragedy of lives being ripped from them, people who had attended the Nova Music Festival, people who had seen their friends mown down in the desert, people who had been living in the kibbutzes and experienced loved ones having lost their lives at the hands of barbaric acts of Hamas as they crossed the border. To this day, as we know, over 100 people are still unaccounted for, people who are held in tunnels in captivity, people who have been tortured and raped, people who have been killed with certainty. We know that. The tragedy on that day, where 1,200 people lost their lives, was the greatest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, where 6 million people were tortured, they were gassed, murdered. And for the Jewish community, as was noted last night by many of the contributors, the last 12 months has been a truly shocking experience, particularly in our country. Not just because of the loss of 1,200 and the indiscriminate way in which those men and women and children were attacked, but also because of the response here in Australia and the rise of anti-Semitism. The attack took place on the 7th of October. Israel hadn't responded. On the 9th of October, on the steps of the Sydney Opera House, people started their chants about where are the Jews. It was eerily similar to what we've seen in the period of the 1930s. And it has started on the 9th of October in this country, and it has run largely unabated over the course of the last 12 months. The Prime Minister himself has outlined details of his own office being protested and picketed, and some of the vile acts that we've seen, supported by the Greens political party and others. The anti-Semitism which is now rife on university campuses, where for months and months and months, people of Jewish heritage, whether they were students or lecturers or visiting fellows, whatever it might have been, were treated as Jews have been treated over the course of history, with disdain and with hatred and with racism. And those campuses have held those protests over a long, long period of time, over many months. We know that we've got Jewish schools in this country that have armed guards permanently present so that young children can go to receive their education without the threat of a terrorist attack. We know that there are aged care facilities in Australia housing elderly, aged Jewish people of Jewish heritage, Jewish Australians, to protect them from an attack. We know that graffiti has been scribbled on the walls of Jewish schools and places of worship. What has happened over the last 12 months is something that our country should be ashamed of. And so last night in New South Wales, in Melbourne, where the Prime Minister attended, here in Canberra, in a service that was organised by His Excellency the Ambassador, and many other points across the country where people held a moment's silence for the loss of October 7. On Saturday, I wrote to the Prime Minister suggesting that we should arrive at a bipartisan position and bring a motion before the House to mark the anniversary of October 7. This motion was supposed to be about October 7, about the loss of human life in the circumstances that we've just graphically outlined and that people across the world now come to understand. I proposed to the Prime Minister a motion which was balanced and objective, and I appreciated the engagement with the Prime Minister when I met with him this morning. Regrettably, we've not been able to arrive at a position of bipartisanship in relation to this matter. And I think when you go to the detail of what the Prime Minister's proposed, it becomes clearer why the Coalition cannot support this motion before the House at the moment. As has been remarked by many commentators over the course of recent weeks, this government has sought to walk both sides of the street in relation to what has been a very divisive debate for our country. It's what in part has given rise to the anti-Semitism that we've seen in university campuses but across society more generally. It's what's making the survivors of the Holocaust for the first time in their lives in our country so that they feel unsafe here in the current environment. So in the motion moved by the Prime Minister today is not just words of comfort and words of recognition in relation to October 7, and I acknowledge those words in his motion. But of course, it goes beyond that. And it's an extension of the way in which the Prime Minister has conducted the debate and himself over the course of the last 12 months, trying to please all people in this debate. Now is not the time to call for, as the Prime Minister does in his motion, and I'll quote the words to the House, Mr Speaker, because I'm not sure that the Prime Minister did. But the words included in the motion at K stresses the need to break the cycle of violence and supports international efforts to de-escalate for a ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon, and for lasting peace and security for Israel, Palestinian, Lebanese and all people in the region. There are other sections here which go well beyond the intent of what should be a motion to mark the loss of life of 1,200 people on the first anniversary. That's what this motion was to be about. But of course the Prime Minister is trying to speak out of both sides of his mouth. And that is not something that we will support in relation to this debate. None of us support the loss of civilian life, and everybody in this place, I'm sure, condemned the actions of a terrorist organisation, a listed terrorist organisation, Hamas, when they put tunnels under schools and under hospitals, when they bury bombs and they store their ammunitions in residential buildings, knowing that they're using people as human shields. But today is the day where this Parliament was meant to mark what should be a solemn moment where 1,200 people lost their lives. And that is the position that we put to the House. Now, we know that under the government's rules here in the chamber, they won't allow amendment to the motion moved by the Prime Minister, which is what's put us in a very difficult position. But a deliberate strategy by the government not to allow any correspondence to be entered into. As I've said, we've gone backwards and forwards with the Prime Minister and his office this morning, in good faith, but not able to reach agreement in relation to this matter. And I think what it says to Australians, Mr Speaker, is that on this day, the 8th of October, the day after, the first sitting day after the 7th of October anniversary, that this Prime Minister wasn't able to lead a moment of bipartisanship in this Parliament, which in my memory is without precedent, Prime Minister. There has always been a bipartisan position between your predecessors. You're citing Biden, France,
Order.
Hawke, Keating. You don't mention them. You don't mention Rudd. You don't mention Gillard. There has been a position of bipartisanship on these issues, and your predecessors would have had the decency to respect the Jewish community in a way that you have not done today. And for that, Prime Minister, you should stand condemned. We have put to this Prime Minister a more than reasonable position, and the Prime Minister has rejected that position for his own political domestic advancement. And that has been recognised by millions of Australians, and for that, the Prime Minister should be condemned. It is unbelievable, Prime Minister. It is this Prime Minister who has departed from the precedent of the Labor Party, the great right of the Labor Party, people who should be speaking up, people who should be out there advocating a position, as Bill Shorten is, as many people, Mr Speaker, in the Labor Party are able to do, but not this Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has taken a position today which has further diminished the Australian Labor Party and is standing with the Australian public.